December 1881, Colorado Mountains. The wind cut down the mountainside like a blade, tearing through pine branches and bending them beneath its fury. Snow swirled across the ridge in violent spirals, blinding and endless. On the porch of a small, weather-worn cabin, Nathaniel Briggs braced himself against the storm. His wool coat was threadbare, his hat pulled low, but still the cold reached his bones. 3 winters he had endured alone up here. Solitude suited him. No neighbors, no questions, no debts owed. But this winter was different. A week ago the letter had come, folded in oilskin, ink faded but clear enough. A suitable domestic companion has been arranged. Cooking, cleaning, and homestead duties expected. Payment in advance. No returns after arrival. Nathaniel hadn't asked for charm or beauty. He'd asked for competence. A strong back, steady hands, silence when needed. That was all. But when he saw her, stumbling through the curtain of snow with a satchel on one shoulder and a bundle pressed close to her chest, he realized what the letter hadn't said. She was pregnant. Her steps were heavy, her breath ragged, but her eyes, dark and unyielding, met his without flinching. She climbed the porch with a kind of grim determination. Snow clung to her lashes and hair. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "If you want a refund, you'll have to wait till spring," she said. "I'm not walking back through that storm." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. His gaze fell to her swollen belly, then back to her face. "I didn't pay for a child," he said evenly. "I didn't ask you to," she answered. "But he's coming either way." For a long moment the wind screamed between them, testing who would yield first. She didn't. Finally, Nathaniel stepped forward, lifted the satchel from her shoulder with surprising gentleness, and pushed the cabin door open. Without another word, he walked inside. She followed. The cabin was small, smelling of cedar smoke and stew long since simmered down. A narrow bed sat in the corner, a pine table in another, shelves crowded with jars and tools. Nathaniel set her bag near the hearth, fed the stove a new log, and finally spoke. "Supper's in 2 hours," he said. "You rest till then." She gave a single nod. No thanks, no apology. Only a weary shrug as she removed her snow-crusted cloak. Then she stepped closer to the fire, one hand outstretched toward the heat, the other resting protectively on her belly. Her face was pale, sharp around the eyes, her mouth pressed into a line that had forgotten how to smile. Nathaniel tossed her a folded blanket. "Bed's yours," he muttered. She lowered herself onto the cot slowly, wincing with the weight of her child. He returned to the stew silent. Outside the storm howled like an old ghost. Inside, 2 strangers sat in uneasy truce, neither expecting kindness, but both too weary to resist the possibility of it. The days passed slow, as if winter itself were holding its breath. January pressed hard against the cabin walls, snow piling high on the eaves until they sagged beneath the weight. Inside, Anna, he learned her name only after several days, worked with quiet diligence. She swept the floors, chopped vegetables, boiled linens. She carried her burden of child without complaint, never once asking for help. Nathaniel watched her in silence. In the mornings, he'd sip black coffee on the porch and see her moving about the cabin with calm precision. At night, the only words exchanged were about supper or chores. It was a cold peace, but peace nonetheless. Until one night, through the crackle of the stove, Nathaniel heard it. A muffled sob from behind her door. Just once. Fragile, broken, like something that slipped free against her will. He did not knock. Instead, he stoked the stove outside her room, placed a tin cup of warm water by her door, and went back to his chair. By morning, the fire still burned strong, and the cup was empty. That evening, Anna found her shawl, once stained with grease and travel dust, washed and neatly folded at the foot of her bed. She said nothing, but when she stepped into the kitchen and found Nathaniel tending the fire, her voice softened. You don't have to be kind, she said quietly. I ain't kind, Nathaniel replied without looking at her. Just decent. There's a difference. Her lips pressed into something almost like a smile. The next night she found a book left on her bed. Old, leather-bound, its pages marked by a torn scrap of paper. Birth preparation. Midwife alternatives. She stood for a long while holding it to her chest. No words were spoken, no thanks offered. But that night, for the first time, she sat across from him at the table. They ate together in silence. And in that silence, something began to thaw. One evening, Anna lingered by the stove after supper. Nathaniel whittled kindling by the fire, his hands steady as ever. My husband died in a labor camp, she said softly. Nathaniel paused, blade still in hand. They accused him of stealing flour. It wasn't true. He was trying to stop a guard from laying hands on me. He hit the man once, just once. They dragged him off that night. Next morning they told me he died. Ribs broken, bleeding inside. They never let me see him. Just gave me his wedding band wrapped in a napkin. Her voice quivered but did not break. Nathaniel set the knife aside, poured her a tin of water, and placed it gently in her hands. Those kinds of stories, he said finally. They've got claws. Don't let go easy. But out here, they can't follow as fast. For the first time, Anna smiled. Small, worn, but real. While Nathaniel bartered for sugar and coffee at the market, he noticed the way one man's eyes lingered on Anna a moment too long. Later, Nathaniel overheard whispers. The widow from Kansas? Someone asked in a low voice. The one whose husband was strung up in the camps? Thought she disappeared. By the next market day, gossip clung to them like smoke. Nathaniel heard it, but he didn't shrink from it. Instead, when he walked into the saloon that evening, he did so with his shoulders square, his jaw set, and his hat tipped back enough to show the fire in his eyes. She works for me, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the din like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. She's under my roof. You want trouble? Then bring it to me. No one answered. No one dared. The silence said enough. That night, Nathaniel saddled her mare outside the barn. He added an extra layer beneath the leather. A thick wool blanket his mother used to keep folded in a cedar chest at the foot of her bed. He adjusted the stirrups with care, making sure the ride would be easy. When Anna came out to help with the feed, she noticed the change. Her eyes narrowed, curious. You're going out tomorrow? Nathaniel explained, brushing down the mare's flank. Best your ride be a warm one. Anna glanced from the blanket to him. You didn't have to, she said softly. I know, Nathaniel replied. Her hand lingered on the woven fabric, tracing the old, faded pattern. Thank you. He gave a short nod and returned to the feed, saying nothing more. But after that night, little things began to shift. When the wind howled and the cold crept under the doors, Nathaniel lit the fire earlier. He kept her boots close to the stove, set kindling beside her room, and filled the kettle before she even asked. Not out of obligation, not anymore, but out of care. Quiet, steady care. And in return, Anna began leaving the lantern burning by the window whenever he rode in late from town. Their words stayed few, but their silences softened. What once was heavy now carried warmth. Spring came slow and muddy, unsure if it was welcome. Frost loosened its grip, streams swelled with snowmelt, and drops fell from the cabin roof like a frozen clock finally thawing. Sunlight stretched longer across the kitchen floor, golden rays catching dust motes suspended like tiny stars. Anna moved slower now, her belly rounded beneath her apron, taut as a promise waiting to be fulfilled. She still worked when Nathaniel allowed it, kneading bread, slicing herbs, folding laundry into neat piles. but every task carried the rhythm of someone determined not to show weakness. Still, Nathaniel noticed the pain in her steps. One afternoon, she bent for kindling and froze halfway. Her hand pressed into her back, her face tightening against the ache. Nathaniel stood watching from the porch, hammer in hand. He said nothing, did nothing in that moment. But the next morning, a low stool appeared beside the wash basin, angled perfectly for her to sit while scrubbing. She paused, studying it. Then she sat, releasing a quiet sigh. She never said thank you. He never brought it up. Yet the silence between them grew less brittle, like glass softening in a fire. A few days later, while Nathaniel mended the chicken coop, her voice called through the open air. "I need help." She did not shout. She did not sound desperate. The words were simple, steady. Like asking for help was no longer a weakness, but a truth. Nathaniel set down his hammer and turned. She stood at the back steps, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding a scrap of paper. He wiped sawdust from his palms. "All right," he said. She handed him the list, written in pencil across a torn envelope. The paper was smudged, but the words were clear. Blankets, boiled string, cotton, scissors. She pointed at the last one. "That needs to be clean. Boiled. Ask the midwife how long." His brow rose. "Clara Mertz," Anna added. "Round woman, braid like a rope. She'll know what you need. Tell her I'm due end of May." Nathaniel gave a curt nod and tucked the paper into his coat. He left before sundown. When he returned the next day, his saddlebags bulged with supplies. Cloth diapers, muslin swaddles, jars of oil, and a worn book titled The Prairie Woman's Guide to Birth and Recovery. He set them on the table without a word. That night, Anna passed through the kitchen and stopped. Nathaniel sat at the table under the dim glow of a lamp, a bolt of flannel spread before him. His rough hands fumbled with scissors, tongue pressed against his lip in concentration, trying to cut the fabric into strips. She leaned against the doorway. "You're doing all this. Why?" Her voice was low, not accusing, curious. He did not answer right away. When he finally looked up, his eyes were dark, heavy with memory. "Because I buried a son once," he said simply. "Didn't get to do a damn thing for him. This time I will." Anna's breath caught. "What happened?" "Fever," Nathaniel replied, voice flat. "Took him in 3 days. His mother not long after." Anna moved closer, sitting across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded, eyes fixed on the fabric. "Me too." The next morning, Anna discovered something new in the cabin. A cradle, hung from a ceiling beam near the window, swayed gently in the draft. It was rough cedar, bent and lashed with cord, lined with wool stitched by an unskilled but determined hand. She stood before it for a long moment, her palm brushing the soft fabric. It wasn't perfect, but it was steady, like him. And for the first time, Anna realized that what had begun as protection had grown into something else. Something strong, unspoken, and real. The cradle swayed softly in the morning breeze, sunlight breaking through the small cabin window and scattering across the quilted cloth. Anna stepped closer, her fingertips brushing along the carved wooden edge as if she were touching something sacred. She did not speak. She didn't need to. The shimmer in her eyes, the way her breath caught for just a moment, carried more meaning than words ever could. By late afternoon, the storm rolled down the mountain. It came fast, like a wall of fury, wind, snow, and lightning crashing against the cabin with a strength Nathaniel had not felt in years. The shutters rattled like dry bones, and the chimney groaned as if it were alive, howling like a wounded beast. Sometime past midnight, while the fire hissed low and shadows pressed against the walls, Anna doubled over near the stove. At first, Nathaniel thought it was nothing, fatigue, maybe. But then came the sharp gasp, one that froze his blood. He looked up from the book he had been pretending to read. He didn't need her to say anything more. He already knew. It's time, she whispered, gripping the edge of the table. Nathaniel half rose. Now? She nodded once, her face pale, her voice steady even as her body trembled. There was no chance of fetching Clara, no possibility of crossing the ridge in this storm. They were alone. Nathaniel's chair scraped across the floor as he shot to his feet. He swept everything from the table, flour, salt, tin mugs, letting it all scatter to the floor. His hands shook as he grabbed blankets. The guidebook fell with a thud. He snatched it up, fumbling through the marked pages. He had read those instructions a dozen times, but now, under the weight of this moment, the words seemed foreign, blurred. Anna clung to the bed frame, her face twisted in pain sharp enough to snap bone. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "You'll be all right," Nathaniel muttered, more to himself than to her. "Just breathe, Anna. Just breathe." She tried. She didn't scream at first, though her eyes clenched shut and her knuckles turned white. Hours blurred together. Sweat soaked her brow, and her damp hair clung to her cheeks. Nathaniel boiled water, wiped her face, changed cloths. He whispered anything that came to mind. Prayers, curses, promises. And then the moment came. "Push!" His voice cracked. "Push! He's almost here." Her cry tore through the cabin like thunder. And then silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against Nathaniel's chest. The child was out, small, limp, slick with blood and fluid. No sound. No cry. Anna collapsed back onto the bed, her chest heaving, her eyes half closed. But Nathaniel didn't see her now. He saw only the child, still and silent. His heart lurched. Panic surged through his veins. He turned the infant over, patted the tiny back. Nothing. His eyes darted to the guidebook. "Clear the airways," it said. His hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped the boy. "God damn it!" he whispered, voice breaking. He bent low, mouth to the baby's, and sucked. Bitter fluid filled his throat. He gagged, spat, tried again. And then, the child jerked. A sputter. A cough. A weak, wavering cry. Nathaniel almost collapsed. His knees buckled as relief flooded him. He wrapped the boy in a clean towel and placed him gently on Anna's chest. She stirred, her hand weak but alive, brushing the baby's cheek. The worst had passed. Nathaniel sat there on the cold floor, shaking, drenched in sweat, his throat raw from shouting. His knees ached, his palms blistered from gripping the hot kettle. His stomach churned from the bitter taste still burning in his mouth. But the baby was alive. Anna was alive. He named him Micah. He carved the letters slowly into a piece of pine, his fingers tracing the grooves with reverence. The name felt alive in his hands, full of promise. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the mountains quiet, silver beneath the sky. Inside the cabin, Anna stirred weakly, her pain deep but dulled now by exhaustion. She turned her head and saw Nathaniel sitting in the rocking chair, bundled in an old quilt. In his arms, the baby slept, tiny fists curled under his chin. Nathaniel rocked gently, humming a low, broken tune. His voice was rough with fatigue, cracking, barely carrying the old lullaby. It was not meant to be heard, but Anna heard it anyway. She watched him, tears in her eyes. The way he looked at Micah, with awe, with fear, with tenderness, melted something in her. "You should be resting," he said softly when he noticed her awake. "I was," she whispered. "But then I heard music." He flushed, embarrassed. "Didn't mean to wake you." She smiled faintly. "You didn't. It was nice." Her voice wavered, then steadied. "You're more of a father than he ever would have been." Nathaniel looked down at the boy. His voice cracked. "Maybe. Or maybe I just learned too late." But she shook her head gently. "No. You learned exactly when you needed to." Later that afternoon, while Anna napped, Nathaniel sat by the fire, wrestling with blue yarn. His big hands fumbled. The stitches slipped. He cursed under his breath, but he refused to stop. Hours passed until finally, he held up a crooked little hat. Lopsided, uneven, ugly. But it was a hat. He placed it beside the cradle and stirred the stew. When Anna woke, she reached for Micah and noticed the hat on his head. She froze, then laughed. A bright, bubbling laugh that filled the cabin. Nathaniel turned, startled. "What's so funny?" She held up the hat, shaking her head. "This poor thing. It's hideous." He folded his arms, pretending to be offended. "I ain't no knitter." "You sure ain't," she teased, still grinning. "Looks like it's trying to be 3 hats at once." Nathaniel chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it fits." She looked at him fully, her smile softer now. "It does." She reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently. And for the first time in a long while, the cabin filled not with grief, but with laughter. Snow slipped from the eaves. The ground turned muddy where winter's grip began to break. The wind no longer howled, it only whispered. And that was when the rider appeared. A lone horseman climbed the trail from the east. His gray coat flapped in the cold wind. A brass badge on his chest caught the sunlight like a warning flare. He dismounted, tall and square-shouldered, with sharp eyes and a trimmed mustache. His boots crunched against the snow as he approached the cabin, brushing the dust from his coat with an air of disdain, as if the land itself offended him. Nathaniel lowered his axe, leaning it against the stump. "Mr. Briggs," the man called. "Who's asking?" Nathaniel replied. The man flashed the badge. "Eddie, Territorial Records and Residency Department. Got a notice from a neighbor. Said your arrangement here raised some concerns." His gaze slid toward the porch. Anna clutched Micah tighter. The agent's tone was cold, clinical. "There's a woman living here. No license of marriage filed. And now a child. Subscribe to Legend of Love Stories, the place where the frontier comes alive with grit, grace, and love that refuses to die. These are not just romances. They are survival stories, redemption stories, stories that bloom where nothing else dares to grow. The cabin stood against the mountain like a scar, weather-beaten and lonesome. Inside, Caleb Holt sat at the rough-hewn table, chewing a strip of dried venison. His hands were scarred from axe work, his beard untrimmed, his eyes sharp as flint. For years, he had lived by his own strength and no one else's. He trusted only himself and the silence of the wilderness. But silence does not feed a man's belly forever. That winter promised to be brutal, and Caleb, though proud, could not hunt and chop and cook and mend without breaking. So he placed word in town, coin for a cook. Nothing more. When she arrived, the townsfolk whispered. Anna May was her name. A widow, belly round with child, hair tucked under a faded kerchief. Her steps were careful on the frosted ground, but her back remained straight. She had lost a husband to a mine collapse, lost her home to debt, and still she walked with dignity, a small sack of belongings over her arm. Caleb opened the door, expecting some stout, motherly woman. Instead, he found a stranger with fire in her eyes and grief shadowing her face. "You'll cook," he said bluntly, looking at her stomach, "and I'll pay." Her voice did not tremble. "I'll cook, but I don't take charity." The days unfolded slow as the thaw of snow. Anna May filled the cabin with the scent of cornbread, with stews thick enough to keep the cold from one's bones. She moved with quiet efficiency, her hands sure despite her swelling belly. Caleb watched, suspicious at first, waiting for her to demand more than her pay. But she asked for nothing. At night, he'd sit by the fire while she mended his torn shirts, her face calm, her eyes softened by lamplight. She spoke little of herself, only humming lullabies as her needle worked. Yet slowly the cabin changed. It no longer felt like a cage of solitude but like a place where life could take root again. One evening, the mountain roared with a storm. The wind howled like wolves, rattling the shutters. Anna May labored by the hearth, her face pale, hand clutching her belly. The child was coming too soon. Caleb, who had felled trees with a single swing, felt helpless as a boy. He fetched water, built the fire high, did as she directed, his hands shaking. Through hours of cries and pain, she fought like a warrior, until a wail pierced the night. A child red and furious with life. Caleb held the newborn, his rough hands trembling. Something in his chest, long buried beneath years of stone, cracked open. He looked at Anna May, exhausted but radiant, tears streaking her cheeks. In that moment, he saw not a widow who had lost, nor a burden he had paid for. He saw grace made flesh. The mountain man who thought he needed no one had been taught by a widow with nothing left but courage. That love was not weakness, that service was not shame, and that even in the harshest winters, one could choose to give instead of guard. When spring came, the cabin did not stand lonely anymore. It rang with a child's laughter, with the clatter of pots, with the sound of two voices speaking not as employer and hired hand, but as family. Caleb never spoke of payment again, for what he had gained was beyond coin. The days after the birth were not easy. The child, a boy with dark hair and lungs that filled the cabin with his wails, kept them both awake through long nights. Caleb, unaccustomed to such fragility, found his hands awkward, his voice uncertain. Yet whenever he faltered, Anna May guided him with patience. "Hold him closer," she would say softly, and Caleb, the man who had never allowed weakness, obeyed. Slowly he learned to rock the boy near the fire, to fetch water with care so as not to spill when Anna May was too tired to rise, to stir a pot without burning it. Every task, small as it seemed, cut into the stone wall he had built around his heart. But the mountain was never kind for long. One bitter dawn, Caleb returned from chopping wood to find Anna May collapsed at the table, her face pale as snow. She had pushed herself too hard, too soon. Panic clawed at him, more fierce than any bear he had faced. He lifted her gently, his voice rough with fear. "Don't you leave me now." For days he cared for her as she once cared for him. He brewed broth, clumsy but determined, and read aloud from the worn Bible she carried in her sack. He kept the boy swaddled by the hearth, pacing the floor when the infant cried, whispering nonsense words just to soothe him. He discovered that strength was not only measured by how much a man could carry, but by how tenderly he could keep another from falling. Anna May recovered slowly, her smile faint but alive. One evening, when the baby finally slept, she spoke in the hush of the firelight. "You hired me to cook, but you've given me more than coin could ever buy. You gave me a place to stand when I had nowhere left." Caleb met her gaze, his throat tight. "And you gave me back a life I thought was gone." Spring melted the mountain's grip. The cabin that once echoed with silence now rang with the clatter of pots, the squeals of a growing child, and laughter, low, unguarded laughter that even surprised Caleb when it left his lips. Neighbors who once pitied Anna May began to whisper again, but this time in wonder. The widow who came with nothing had tamed the mountain man, not by force, not by bargain, but by grace. Years passed, but the lessons endured. Caleb never forgot the night he held a newborn for the first time, nor the moment he realized that strength was not in standing alone, but in choosing to stand beside another. And Anna May, who had buried her past in grief, found that her hands could shape not only bread, but a future, wild, untamed, but alive, like the mountain itself. Together, they carved a life out of stone and snow. Not perfect, not without struggle, but one that bore fruit in ways neither had expected. And if ever asked what he had truly paid for when he hired that widow to cook, Caleb would only shake his head, eyes distant, and say, "I paid for a meal, but I was given grace." He mountain tested them every season. Droughts cracked the soil, storms tore shingles from the roof, wolves prowled the tree line at night. Yet through every trial, Anna May and Caleb stood together. Where once he had faced storms alone with grit and silence, now he faced them with her voice steady at his side. The boy, Samuel, grew quick and strong. He shadowed his father through the forest, learning the lay of the land, the snap of snares, the reverence due to a running stream. But it was Anna May who taught him tenderness, how to cradle a wounded bird until it could fly, how to knead bread with patience, how to speak truth even when fear pressed against his chest. Neighbors came to see them not as curiosities but as a family forged in hardship. Travelers stopped by for shelter and left speaking of the widow's warmth, the mountain man's quiet courtesy. In time, their cabin became a refuge, not just for themselves but for anyone who needed a hot meal or a listening ear. Years rolled on. Lines crept into Anna Mae's face, silver into Caleb's beard. Their bodies slowed, but their bond only deepened. One autumn evening, after the harvest had been laid by, Caleb sat on the porch, whittling a piece of pine while the sun spilled gold over the ridges. Anna Mae joined him, shawl around her shoulders, the smell of cornbread still clinging to her hands. "You've grown soft," she teased, eyes bright despite the wrinkles at their corners. Caleb chuckled low. "Or maybe I just learned what matters." He reached across the space between them, calloused fingers brushing hers. "You gave me that." Their silence was full, no longer empty as in the years before her. The mountain no longer felt like punishment, but a witness to their life together. When Samuel married and built his own cabin farther down the ridge, he often returned with his children tumbling through the door, filling the house with noise. Caleb would watch Anna Mae with the little ones in her lap, her laughter ringing out as clear as it had the first day she crossed his threshold. He knew then, beyond any doubt, that she had remade him, taught him grace not by sermon or lecture, but by living it before him day after day. One winter, when age weighed heavy on his bones, Caleb fell ill. The fever burned as it once had in his younger years, and he feared he might not rise again. Anna Mae stayed at his side, as she always had, whispering prayers, cooling his brow. "Don't you leave me," she said softly, echoing the words he once cried to her. He opened his eyes, weak but steady. "I won't. Not until you send me." He recovered, though slower than before, and when spring broke the snow, he rose to see the garden Anna Mae had tended still pushing against the earth, stubborn as ever. In their twilight years, when their hair had gone to silver and their hands to leather, they sat together on the porch with the mountains spread wide before them. Caleb, the man once hardened by solitude, rested his hand over hers. "I thought I bought a cook," he murmured, voice thick with memory. Anna Mae smiled, eyes glistening. "No, you bought a chance to learn what love could be." And when at last the years claimed them, the mountain did not stand silent. It carried forward their laughter, their struggles, their grace, etched not in stone but in the lives they had touched. The cabin endured, filled by the generations that followed, a testament that even in the harshest places, love could carve out a home. Samuel grew tall, his shoulders broad from splitting wood, his spirit tempered by both his father's stern lessons and his mother's gentle wisdom. He married a schoolteacher from the valley, and together they raised children under the shadow of the same mountain that had shaped him. Yet Samuel carried something more than skill or strength. He carried memory. He remembered the nights his mother soothed his fever with hymns, the mornings his father's silence softened into laughter, the times when their home had opened to strangers in need. That memory became his compass. The mountain did not grow kinder with time. A flood one spring swept away fences and tore the soil from his field. The youngest of his children fell sick one cruel winter, and Samuel felt the same helplessness he had once seen in his father's eyes. He fell to his knees by the bedside, his calloused hands folded, his prayer cracked and raw, and as if across years, he heard his mother's voice. "Hold on, Samuel. Even in the storm, there is grace." The child recovered, and Samuel, like Caleb before him, learned that strength was not in control, but in surrender to God, to love, to the stubborn will to keep going. When Caleb finally passed, it was quiet, with Anna Mae's hand in his. His last words were simple, spoken with the rough tenderness of a man remade. "Thank you for teaching me." Anna Mae lived on, her back bent but her spirit unbowed, watching her grandchildren run through the same crooked rows of the garden she once planted in barren earth. To them, she was not just a grandmother. She was proof that hope could take root in the hardest ground. Samuel built onto the old cabin rather than abandon it. He carved each beam with care, not out of necessity but out of reverence. And when travelers asked him why he stayed on a mountain that demanded so much and gave so little, he would smile the way his mother once did. "Because this place remembers." Years rolled into decades. The cabin weathered storms, fire, and sorrow, but it also carried laughter, weddings, births, and countless meals shared around its rough-hewn table. The mountain remained what it always was, unyielding, stern, and vast. But within its shadow, a legacy of grace endured. One day, long after Anna May herself had gone, Samuel stood with his eldest son, showing him how to plant seeds in the garden soil. The boy complained of the rocky ground, of the stubborn weeds. Samuel only smiled and pressed the seed into his son's palm. "This land doesn't give easy," he said. "But neither did your grandmother. And look what she grew." The child bent low, pressing the seed into the dirt. Above them, the wind carried the faintest scent of pine and earth, and somewhere, hidden in the mountain silence, the story of Caleb and Anna May lingered. Two lives bound not by coin, but by grace, forever rooting new life where once there was only stone. Samuel's children grew up under the same mountain winds that had hardened their grandfather's hands and softened his heart. They knew the creak of the old porch, the scent of cornbread at dawn, and the way their grandmother Anna May's stories carried more weight than the stones lining the garden path. Each child bore the mountain differently. Elias, the eldest, inherited Caleb's quiet strength. He was steady, slow to speak, with a gaze that seemed carved from the granite cliffs above them. He carried the land like a burden and a calling, never willing to leave it. Ruth, fiery and unyielding, carried Anna May's spirit. She became a teacher, walking miles through snow and mud to teach children in scattered valley cabins. "The world needs more than bread," she said. "It needs wisdom and kindness." And little Thomas, the youngest, dreamed beyond the ridge lines. He wandered the mountain trails with restless feet, sketching rivers and ridges in notebooks, whispering of cities and horizons far away. His heart was tethered to the mountain, yet tugged by the world beyond. When Anna May finally passed, her funeral drew neighbors from miles around. Farmers, hunters, travelers, faces that had once been strangers, stood weeping by her grave. She had been more than a widow who cooked. She had been a shelter in storm, a voice of grace, a reminder that even in the hardest places, love could thrive. Samuel, now gray himself, looked upon his children and grandchildren gathered around the cabin. He realized that his parents' story was no longer just his inheritance. It was a torch, and he knew he must pass it on. Years stretched again. The grandchildren grew like the garden, crooked in some places, flourishing in others. They chased each other down the rocky paths, climbed trees that Caleb once felled for lumber, and learned the same lullabies Anna May once hummed by the fire. But the world was changing. Railroads crept closer, and with them came merchants, noise, and the temptation of easier lives in towns below. Elias stayed, but Thomas left for the city. Letters came, ink blotched with longing and guilt. Ruth remained between them both, reminding her brothers that leaving did not mean forgetting. One summer, when Samuel was old and his breath came shallow, his children gathered at his bedside. The mountain wind rattled the shutters the way it had on the night Anna May first labored in that same room. Samuel lifted a trembling hand, resting it on Elias's shoulder. "This land is more than soil," he rasped. "It remembers the hands that worked it, your grandfather's strength, your grandmother's grace, our struggles, our laughter, our prayers. Do not forget. Whether you stay or whether you wander, carry this with you. What we grew here was not just food. It was love." When Samuel passed, the cabin stood once more at a crossroads of time. Elias tended the soil, Ruth taught the young, and Thomas returned years later with children of his own, their city shoes scuffing the mountain paths. They gathered by the fire where Caleb once sat, where Anna May once hummed, where Samuel once prayed. And there, in the flicker of firelight, a new generation listened. Wide-eyed, they heard of a mountain man who thought he bought a meal but was given a woman who taught him grace. They heard of a widow who carried life into barren ground. They heard of storms, hunger, joy, and laughter that survived the winter winds. The children leaned closer, drawn not just to the story but to the truth pulsing through it. that even in the harshest places, love takes root. And as long as someone remembers, it grows. Generations passed, but the cabin still stood against the mountain. Weathered beams leaned, the roof had been mended countless times, and the garden stretched wild, curling around rocks and spilling into paths. Yet the land remembered. Every child who walked its soil seemed to carry the echo of Caleb's grit and Anna Mae's grace. By the mid-20th century, the world below had changed beyond recognition. Highways carved valleys, radios sang from kitchen counters, and factories replaced fields. Many descendants of Samuel left the mountain, chasing work, education, and the promise of ease. Yet always someone stayed. Always one branch of the family remained to keep the cabin alive. Elias's grandson, Jonathan, was one such keeper. He fought in a war overseas, carrying in his pocket a letter from his grandmother that read, "The mountain is with you. Remember what you come from." When he returned, scarred and older than his years, he chose not to flee from hardship, but to build his family where roots already lay. He repaired the cabin, restored the garden, and raised his children beneath the same pine-shadowed ridge. One of those children, Miriam, became a storyteller. She left for the city but returned each summer with notebooks filled with poems and tales. Around the fire pit, under skies bright with stars, she told the younger cousins the story of Caleb and Anna Mae. She told it as a parable, a love story, and a truth. You are here because two broken people chose to stand together instead of apart. The children listened, eyes wide, just as Samuel once had. By the time the 21st century dawned, the cabin had become more than a home. It was a pilgrimage site for the family. Weddings were held under the trees. Funerals ended at the garden where the first seeds once fought to live. Births were celebrated with lullabies that had crossed generations. And still the story was told. A young woman named Clara, great-great-granddaughter of Samuel, found herself one summer sitting on the same porch Caleb had once whittled pine upon. She was pregnant, abandoned by the child's father, fearful of raising life alone. The world outside offered quick solutions and loud opinions. But here, on the mountain, she heard something quieter. Her grandmother Ruth placed a hand on hers and said, "You come from a line of people who endured. A widow once came here with nothing but a child in her belly and courage in her heart. She thought she was only cooking for a man, but instead she taught him grace. That's who you are. That's what you carry." Clara wept, but when she rose, she was steadier. She stayed in the cabin through the autumn, and when her daughter was born, she named her Mae. Now, more than a century since Caleb's first bargain, the cabin is still alive. The wood groans, the stone hearth is blackened with years of smoke, the garden grows unruly, but within its walls, stories breathe. Children still hear the tale of a mountain man who tried to pay for a cook and received a woman who changed him. They learn that strength is not only in chopping wood or facing storms, but in the courage to love when loss has broken you. And if you listen to the wind that sweeps across the ridge, some say you can still hear Anna Mae's lullabies woven into the pines, carrying forward the truth she planted. Grace is stronger than stone. Love is harder than winter. And what is sown in hardship can bloom for generations. Clara's daughter, little Mae, grew up listening to the story as if it were scripture. On stormy nights, when wind rattled the shutters and rain lashed the cabin roof, her grandmother would whisper, "This house has known worse and still it stands, and so will you." Mae carried that story into classrooms when she became a teacher. She carried it into hospital wards when she became a nurse. She carried it into the quiet of her own life when she raised children of her own. Wherever she went, the mountain followed her. Not in soil or stone, but in spirit. And yet, no matter how far the descendants scattered, the cabin remained the anchor. Some came only in summers, others returned to stay. Weddings still gathered under its sagging porch. Funerals still ended at the garden. The earth, stubborn and rocky, still bloomed with life in defiance of the mountain's harshness. Over time, the story of Caleb and Anna Mae ceased to be told only around fires. It was written into journals, stitched into quilts, carved into a wooden sign nailed above the cabin door. Grace grows here, Visitors from the valley began to hear whispers of the tale. A rugged man and a widow, bound not by contract but by compassion. Strangers who stayed the night left changed, not because of the beds or the food, but because the place itself seemed to breathe with the memory of their love. As the years slipped into a new century, May's children, Caleb and Anna May's great-great-great-grandchildren, began filming the story, sharing it with the wider world. What began as a family memory turned into a documentary, then into articles, then into a book. People far beyond the mountain read of the man who thought he could pay for service but instead received redemption. And in every telling, one truth remains steady. Grace cannot be bought, only received. One autumn, on the cabin's 150th year, the family gathered. Dozens of descendants, some from cities, some still rooted in mountain soil, circled the cabin. They planted trees along the ridge, each child pressing a sapling into the rocky earth. As they worked, an elder told the story again. Caleb's gruffness, Anna May's courage, the birth of Samuel, the garden that never stopped blooming. The children listened, wide-eyed, as if hearing it for the first time. And when night fell, lanterns lit the porch, and voices rose together in song, echoing Anna May's lullabies into the same mountain winds that once carried her voice alone. The cabin stood, crooked and scarred, yet proud. The mountain loomed, as unyielding as ever. But beneath its shadow, something stronger had grown. Not walls or gardens, not even bloodlines, but a legacy of grace that refused to die. And so, the story became more than family. It became folklore, a parable whispered to those weary of loss, those hardened by solitude, those who believed they had nothing left to give. The widow who cooked, the mountain man who learned, the grace that endured. Even now, when storms lash the ridge and the night grows dark, the cabin does not fall silent. For within its timbers, within its garden soil, within the memory of all who came after, Anna May still whispers, "You never needed rain to grow something beautiful." Generations turned again. The world outside the mountain grew louder. Machines, screens, voices clamoring across distance. Cities swelled, traditions thinned. Many families forgot where they came from, but the descendants of Caleb and Anna May never forgot. By the mid-21st century, the cabin was no longer just a family refuge. It had become a foundation, literally and spiritually. Samuel's great-great-great-grandchildren formed a trust to preserve it, not as a museum, but as a place of retreat. They called it the House of Grace. Travelers, burdened by grief or burned out by the endless noise of the modern world, found their way up the winding trail. Some came seeking silence. Others came because they had heard a whisper of the story, the mountain man who paid for a meal but received grace instead. They came with questions, doubts, weariness. And though no one charged them coin, they always left with something they could not name, something they carried home like fire in the chest. One young visitor, a soldier scarred by war, sat on the porch one evening where Caleb once whittled pine. He confessed to a descendant that he felt hollow, unworthy of living when his friends had not. The elder placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're not the first broken man to sit here. This house was built on brokenness made whole." The soldier wept, and for the first time, felt the possibility of healing. Another, a widow heavy with grief, walked through the crooked rows of the garden and felt the weight of Anna May's story. She whispered, "If she could bloom again, maybe I can too." As decades moved on, the story spread further, not just in books and films, but in lives changed by its echo. The family, now scattered across continents, carried the parable wherever they went. In classrooms, in pulpits, in hospitals, in quiet conversations, they spoke of Caleb and Anna May, not as myth, not as exaggeration, but as truth, that love born in hardship can outlast generations. And still, each year, the family returned to the mountain. They came with babies in arms, with old ones in wheelchairs, with songs and prayers and the laughter of children chasing each other through the crooked garden rows. They did not come to worship the past, but to remember the seed that started it all. On the bicentennial of Caleb and Anna May's first meeting, the cabin stood surrounded by hundreds of descendants and friends. The air shimmered with voices raised in gratitude, not just for bloodlines, but for the legacy of grace that had carried them. A young child, no older than 6, tugged at her mother's dress and asked, "Mama, is the story true? Did a mountain man really pay for a widow to cook for him?" Her mother knelt, brushing the child's cheek with a smile. "Yes, my love, but what he received was so much more. And because of that, we are all here." The child thought for a moment, then whispered, "Then I will tell it too." And so the story lives, passed from voice to voice, heart to heart, across time. The cabin may one day fall, the garden may fade, but the truth will remain, that grace cannot be bought, that love can grow in the hardest soil, and that one widow, one man, and one act of courage can ripple into centuries. Centuries rolled on. The cabin weathered storms, fires, and seasons of abandonment. Roof beams fell and were replaced, stones crumbled and were reset, gardens were left wild and then revived again. Families came and went, but the story never left. By the 23rd century, the cabin was no longer only a family relic. It had become a pilgrimage site. Scholars studied its records, storytellers wove its tale into books and ballads, and weary travelers made their way up the mountain to walk the same crooked rows of the garden where Anna May once pressed her seeds into stubborn earth. The world had changed. Machines roamed the valleys. Lights glowed in cities that never knew darkness. Voices carried across continents in an instant. Yet even in that age of abundance and speed, people came to the mountain to remember something simple, that grace cannot be bought. Some came to seek healing from grief. Others came to remember that strength is not measured in isolation, but in love given freely. Many came just to stand where the story was born, to touch the rough wood of the rebuilt cabin, to walk the path Samuel once trod, to hear the wind that still carried whispers of Anna May's lullabies. Over time, the tale of Caleb and Anna May ceased to be spoken only as history. It became parable. Teachers used it in schools to show that compassion is stronger than coin. Leaders quoted it when urging reconciliation over conflict. Families told it to children at bedtime, not because the details mattered anymore, but because the truth within it never aged. And though centuries blurred fact and memory, the story itself remained sharp. A hardened man who thought he was buying a service, and a widow who taught him grace instead. That kernel of truth could not be eroded by time. One spring, nearly 300 years after Caleb first opened his cabin door to Anna May, a young pilgrim stood at the garden's edge. The world she had come from was filled with wealth, yet empty of peace. She knelt in the rocky soil, pressing a seed into the earth. Her lips trembled as she whispered words passed through centuries. "You never needed rain to grow something beautiful." The wind shifted, pine needles rattled, and though no voice answered, she rose with a steadier heart. In that moment, the cabin was not just timber and stone, not just history, not just family. It was testimony, proof that one act of courage, one act of love, could ripple across ages and remind even the unborn that grace is stronger than stone, and love is harder than winter. And so, the legend of Caleb and Anna May lived, not just in family lines, not just in stories, but in the marrow of humanity itself.